I bet you've all heard about Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, but what you might not have heard about is that Iron Man is actually based on a real individual. Of course, there's no shame for not knowing that. I mean, you don't necessarily see individuals who shoot lasers out of their chests or their eyes and these superheroes and think, oh, I wonder who that is actually based on in real life. Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, actually is based on somebody, and that person is Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes, born December 24th, 1905, and lived until 1976. Howard Hughes was a billionaire. He was an entrepreneur. He was a business mogul, and he was a bit of a playboy. He was also an inventor, very similar to Tony Stark. In fact, he actually looked very similar, should I say. Tony Stark looked very similar to him with his pencil mustache and his shorter hair and sort of coiffed look. We actually have Stan Lee, who has said very blatantly that Howard Hughes was a huge inspiration for Tony Stark, and actually naming Tony Stark's father Howard. Get it? Hopefully now the pieces are coming together as a final homage to, yes, this is a tribute to Howard Hughes. Like Tony Stark, Howard Hughes was sort of born into money. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was actually a bit of an inventor himself and made millions off of coming up with a new type of drill bit that they used down in Texas to mine oil. It was a huge hit. It was super successful. So when Howard Hughes came along, Jr., that is, he had just a ton of money. But he did actually work. He tried to put it to use, tried to turn it into more money, which he did successfully by first getting into the film industry. He produced, at that point in time, the most expensive films known to man, and then later on was known for his inventions and aviation work, particularly his work as a pilot. For instance, he flew around the world in less than 4 days, setting records for aviation speed and also aviation businesses. He created an aviation company which they actually made airplanes. Hughes was even commissioned by the United States government to build a massive airplane, and it was called the Spruce Goose, and it cost, in today's numbers, over $300 million, and it came in just a little bit too late and way over budget. It ended up only making one flight for, I think, around 200 yards before landing, and it was totally scrapped. Scrapped as an idea, of course. You can still see the Spruce Goose at a museum. Hughes was also part of a CIA plot. 1968, a Russian submarine sunk, and the United States government wanted to make a ship that was big enough to carry the entire submarine back to the United States, but knew that if they constructed this monstrosity, that it would raise some suspicion. So the CIA actually created some sort of ruse in which they stated that this big ship was actually Hughes's and was being built as a way to mine for minerals on the bottom of the ocean. And it would have been a success too if the submarine hadn't have broken when the ship tried to pick it up. A particular feature that Tony Stark has over Howard Hughes is his likability. For instance, Howard Hughes just had a lot of weird things about him. For instance, he was obsessed with women's anatomy. When he was producing movies, he would design bras for the actresses that made them very uncomfortable. He liked women with very large personalities, and he actually instructed his driver to avoid bumpy roads, and if he was on bumpy roads with those women, to not exceed 2 miles an hour, because he believed that the turbulence of the cars would actually damage their personalities. He was also a huge ice cream fan, mainly of Baskin-Robbins, and his favorite flavor was banana nut. Well, the company canceled it. He threw a world-class hissy fit to the point where they actually promised to ship him basically enough ice cream to feed a small city, which he agreed. And then once he got that shipment, he decided that he was actually more of a French vanilla fan, and the company that ended up receiving all of those spent years and years and years trying to get rid of that stock. Thus, he was kind of a douchebag. And apparently, he got really drawn into the stuff he was watching, and instead of being bothered to get up and go to the bathroom, he kept jars next to him which he would empty his bladder into, and then instead of getting rid of these urine-filled jars, he would actually keep them in his closet. So he had an entire closet filled with urine-filled jars, which is kind of weird considering he also had incredible, probably one of the worst cases of obsessive compulsive disorder that was never diagnosed that I've ever seen, presenting with a lot of germophobia for a person who lived with germophobia, who's basically living in his own filth. And that brings us to this video, which is discussing his very, very strange culinary habits. He had very unique tastes and things that he wanted to eat. We really only ate a very limited amount of things, and they were paired with his obsessive compulsive disorder. It just made for something very, very strange. And so today we're going to be making his favorite dish, which is going to be steak and peas. And of course, it's not just regular, because that would be just way too normal. So to start off with, Howard only liked his steaks butterflied. Now, what a butterfly means is that you're actually going to take your steak, you're going to press down on that steak, and you're going to open it like the wings of a butterfly, thereby making a much thinner steak. This technique is idiotic, in my opinion. There's no reason for it. In fact, you take a steak that has the ability to be temperature controlled, that has the ability to have tenderness to it, and you smash it down into half the size, and you completely destroy anything that was good about that cut to begin with. So I went to the grocery store trying to find a cut that would be good for this, based on the fact that you do have to have a steak that is at least an inch thick. Otherwise, you're just going to be cutting a half-inch steak, a quarter of an inch, and that's just absurd. And so I found a lot of things: top sirloin, ribeyes, filet mignon. And eventually I decided to pick up a chuck eye steak, which is very similar to a ribeye, and it was the thickest cut of meat I could find. I'll start out with the chuck eye steak. We're going to slap down a cutting board and get one of our sharpest knives. Now we're going to press firmly against that steak, and what it's going to do is trap those fibers, sort of make more of a solid instead of something that's going to be moving around, because we need to try to cut through it very succinctly, almost like samurai slash, instead of sawing motion. As you see, the very first steak I could not get into. For instance, when I first started doing that, I realized I had gotten the complete wrong steak. Why? Because the chuck eye steak is very much fatty, very tender, and that fat is absolutely impossible to cut through. I might as well try to be cutting through a redwood tree with a Q-tip. It just was not going to happen, and totally destroyed the first steak by trying to do a sawing motion. But luckily I had a second one, so I picked up the second one, and it took me a long time to do, but finally I managed to butterfly it, spread it open, and at that point in time I realized that I disturbingly made a bit of an angel figure, which went on to be a little bit sacrilegious as I continued cooking it in this angel steak, which you will hear me refer to it as. That was definitely not part of the plan, but here we are. And I also have sous chef Steven here to help me in case anything goes awry or falls to the ground. Now the second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to preheat the pan. For this, I'm using a cast iron. For steaks, I usually always like to try to use a cast iron. To start off with a cast iron, I need to get it screaming hot, because the steak is so thin. If I want to cook it medium rare, which is what supposedly Howard enjoyed, I have to basically flash fry it, because if I leave it on there for any period of time, it's just going to get rough. Using vegetable oil, because vegetable oil takes a very high heat before it burns, and I put it on a very high heat, waiting for that oil to get ready. How I test to see if the oil is ready is I'll just take a little bit of water, flick it in the pan, and then that water is going to bubble and start to go crazy if the pan and the oil is hot enough. So of course, in this point in time, I'm going to give it very little time, because it's so thin, before I take off the mesh and flip it over. At that point in time, I'm going to let it cook for just another maybe 30 to 45 seconds, maybe. And then at that point in time, I'm going to remove it from the heat, and I'm going to put it on a cutting board. At this point in time, it's rare, it's nowhere near done, but I want to stop cooking it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the skillet, I'm going to dump the oil, and then I'm going to come back. When we come back, I'm going to reduce the heat to almost being a low medium heat, and I'm going to toss in some butter. I started off with 3 tablespoons of butter, and then I grabbed some garlic. With that garlic, I smashed that garlic, and then I put it in the pan. At that point in time, I realized I didn't grab enough butter, so I put another tablespoon and then let that melt. I also grabbed a handful of thyme, and I put that in there. Also be careful with the thyme, because it will splatter. Once that was all done, I went ahead and grabbed my angel steak, and I put it back in the pan on very low to medium. It's not going to really cook, but what it's going to do is it's going to absorb all those flavors that I put in there. I'm going to grab the pan and turn it around so I can actually butter baste it. And what that means is that I'm pulling all the butter to one side using the spoon, and I'm scooping it to go over that steak, thereby getting that butter in all of the nooks and the crannies. At this point in time, I'm done. Very much like myself at this point, the steak needs to rest. And what resting does is allows that steak to soak up all those juices and to stop basically the cooking process, but to also allow it to rest, relax the fibers, and tenderize a little bit. Now, up until this point, we haven't really been hurt that much with how we've had to change our things to accommodate Howard, but this is kind of where things get a little bit interesting. If I can read a excerpt from his memorandum that he wrote in his own hand: no matter how extreme the emergency, no matter how unusual the circumstances may be, no matter what have arisen, it is extremely important to me that nobody ever goes into any room, closet, cabinet, drawer, bathroom, or any other area used to store any of the things which are for me, either food, equipment, magazines, paper, supplies. It is equally important to me that nobody ever opens a door or opening to my room, cabinet, or closet, or anything used to store all of my things, even for 1/1000th of an inch. Howard had one of the most severe cases of germophobia that I have ever seen. In fact, he actually, in his memorandum, wrote a 9-step process for opening a can of peas. So I thought, not only do I want to make this according to what Howard would want, I also want to do it in the fashion that Howard would want. And then I had an idea. Perfect. Now, the only negative thing about me getting all dressed up in hazmat suit is that sous chef Steven had no idea what I was doing, but decided he wanted nothing to do with it and took off on me. After suiting up, I got to work on step number 3, which is prepping the can to be opened. Now, what you have to do in the Hughes memorandum is you have to allow the can to soak for a little bit in order to peel off the label. So I did that. At that point in time, I was able to peel off the label, and of course at that point in time, now we have to scrub. So we have to grab a bristle brush and we have to scrub the nooks and crannies starting from 2 inches down on either side of the can to make sure that that can is as clean as humanly possible, holding it in the center of the can at all times. Now, it is very important not to look at the peas, not to breathe on the peas, not to allow any skin contact to the peas, and not to even really be human next to the peas. You want to try to make yourself as germ-free as possible. Remember, this is the same man who lived in a room full of his own urine, but we have to be careful with these peas, and we are going to, darn it. And so once we did that, go ahead and grab a can opener, making sure that I held on to the center of the can at all times if I could. Next, we were going to drain the peas, and this is where the fun part comes in. That's right, there is a fun part. See, Howard would only eat 20 peas, and he would only eat these peas if they were equal in weight and size. If you gave him peas that were not almost identical, he would refuse to eat them, either by picking them out or forcing you to redo it. And so now became the arduous task of pouring out these peas and trying to find 20 identical peas, discarding the peas that were not completely identical. Either having believed that I conquered those 20 equal peas or simply being unwilling to continue, I decided that that was enough. I put the rest of the peas in, and then sous chef Steven was able to come in and collect what was fallen during the great pea counting debacle. So now that I was as done as I was going to be, I decided that I was going to grab my angel steak and plate it. Probably one of the worst examples of butterflying a steak, but hey, as I said, it's a stupid technique that is not used anymore. It's almost a way to destroy a perfectly good steak, but he would only eat it if it was butterflied. And then put the peas on the plate. Now, it doesn't stop there, because Howard had a very particular way that he wanted his peas to be aligned. He would put them in rows. Sometimes they might differ, but they always had to be in straight line. Now, as an inventor, Hughes also designed something called a pea rake. See, in order to get these peas in the lines that he wanted, he invented this little tool to allow him to do that. Now, shockingly, I did not have one of these pea rakes in my own cabinets, and so I just had to make do with a fork. Using these forks to try to navigate this pea hurdle and to put it into straight lines, I realized why a rake is necessary, because it absolutely is awful. And once I had those peas in a straight line, the meal was done. You had an angel steak. I still can't believe that happened. And you have your peas in a straight line. The meal wasn't that bad, especially just the way that it's cooked. I think you could follow that same strategy with any particular type of steak and it will end up good. The butterflying thing is totally useless and totally stupid to actually try to do that technique. You're taking a perfectly fine steak and making it seem that much cheaper. And I don't know what the point is of only consuming 20 peas. You're really not getting hardly anything at all. And it was just weird and confusing. Thank you for watching this episode of Double D. Now you can go out and tell your friends that you know the story of Tony Stark. He's real and a little bit stranger than you probably thought. Even against the real Tony Stark, you can see that they cleaned up Tony a little bit. Howard Hughes wasn't the most beloved character, but an interesting character nonetheless. I will see you all in the next episode. Bye-bye.